Uh, Kia ora, everyone. Good to see you. I'm imagining our clerk is just lining up Kiwis for the treaty, and once we get those on, we'll crack straight into it. Kia ora, kia ora, Mike. I'm assuming that you're submitting for Kiwis for the treaty. If that's the case, we've got 10 minutes set aside for you, including questions. It'd be great if you could leave us some time for questions. But without further ado, I'll hand straight over to you. Kia ora.
Oh, thank you, Duncan. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Mike Sleigh. I'm the chairperson of Kiwis for the treaty, which we formed last year to give Middle New Zealand an opportunity or a platform which they could use to support the treaty. Personally, I'm a fifth generation New Zealander, Pākehā New Zealander, and I've worked through my career in private investment, corporate management, and as an RMA lawyer with some leading law firms. The Kiwis for the treaty now has 700 supporters. They come from all walks of life, occupations, political parties, ages, and races. And we all have a unifying purpose that we all believe that the treaty should be used to unify all New Zealanders. Our written submission contained a number of reasons why we thought the proposed bill shouldn't proceed. But I have the feeling that many of those have been addressed by other lawyers who have been practicing more recently than me. And as a result, we've decided we wanted to talk about some sort of more about core issues and about ways forward, possible ways forward. But just to help illustrate this, I thought I'd take it from a bit of my own personal story. My ancestor on my father's side was a fellow called Ralph Sleigh, who arrived in 1860 in Dunedin and ended up on the goldfields, where he was recruited by the Waikato militia, a forerunner of the New Zealand Army. He did pretty well there. I don't hate to imagine what he actually did, but he was rapidly promoted to captain in charge of 80 mounted cavalry. In 1865, however, he drowned in the Wellington Harbour. He was 25 and he left a widow and 2 children. But he also left them land that he had been given for his military service, which was confiscated from Marae in Howick. And he'd also brought off other junior ranks. On my mother's side, there was a George Archibald who came from Scotland, a bit later, 1879, and he brought Inverness and Bogroy stations on the Waitaki River. It's not known whether George knew that Ngāi Tahu was actively challenging the lawfulness of that land, because their view is they didn't sell the Mackenzie Basin or the Waitaki River. But what he would have been aware of, interestingly, is that the armed constabulary rode across his farm on the way to evict the prophet Te Maiharoa, who with 100 people was based at Amaurama and was contesting the ownership of that very land. In any event, George Archibald had the benefit of owning the farmland, which was either never sold by Ngāi Tahu or was sold for a minimal amount. While my family no longer owns that farmland, either in Howick or the Waitaki, we have indirectly enjoyed the benefit of that initial capital assets. We've all become professionals or farmers, and we've all been well educated, even if we hadn't seen the direct funds. So we've become comfortably middle class. In contrast, arguably the rightful owners have received none of those benefits. This story repeated itself across nearly all of New Zealand. It saw iwi go from 99% ownership in 1840 to less than 4% ownership of the North Island and none of the South Island by 1910. Much of it was taken by the government through confiscation or dishonest land purchasing. The land was even taken despite the fact that Marae had fed, sheltered and protected the original settlers that came to New Zealand in the 1830s and 1840s, and that they'd also demonstrated their very own ability as successful farmers and merchant traders. The settlements with various tribes since the 1990s have sought to deal with the impacts of this loss. However, the various governments of the day have only been willing to compensate iwi with 1 to 2% of the value of the land that they lost. Ironically, Pākehā have been entitled to 100% of the value of any land taken for public works since about 1857 or something. So it has been a very unequal situation. This massive wealth transfer enabled Pākehā in particular to build a big capital base. In direct contrast, Marae has been left struggling with the lowest average household incomes, lowest standard of living, and significant housing, health and education challenges, and the highest rate of imprisonment. It is a terrible story, and it is only now that I understand why we don't teach anything about this in our schools, universities, or even our places of worship, because it would so undermine Pākehā's moral, religious, and political authority, as well as putting their economic interests at risk. So it's with this brutal and I'd say rather confronting background, or confronting to Pākehā, that we have found it so shocking to think that anyone could even consider putting a bill such as the proposed one in front of Parliament. It's just and a bill which seeks to remove what few rights Māori have left. So what can we do? Well, I suppose that is the elephant in the room. We could stick to the status quo, and that would mean that we would continue to fail to improve any metrics for Māori and potentially just see them get worse. And we could hide our ancestors' ram raid from the rest of New Zealand. There are alternative options to make significant innovative change. So imagine this is 2040, we're celebrating the treaty, 200 years, and at that celebration, we're thrilled to hear that all the metrics that we measure Pākehā and Māori by equal each other, and that Māori now have the same rates as Pākehā for average household income and wealth, home ownership, life expectancy, unemployment, and so on. And all New Zealanders have a good knowledge of New Zealand history and Māori culture, and we're seen finally as a global leader in race relations. So how can we achieve this? As a Christchurch citizen, I witnessed the horrific destruction of the Christchurch earthquakes and knew some of the people that were, the 185 people that were killed in it. It did huge amounts of damage. It did $40 billion worth of damage at the time, 20% of our GDP. And we saw 100,000 houses repaired and 8,000 demolished. But the government and the public in general committed to restoring Christchurch to being the second strongest city or second biggest city in the country, to the degree that the Prime Minister at the time, Sir John Key, came down every single week for probably 2 years for at least a day or 2 days to just drive the thing forward. So the government was behind pulling this off, and they did. 14 years later, we live in one of the best cities in New Zealand. Our university's rolled as highest it's ever been. So I suppose our view is that we could use that same ability to try and really change all these statistics and situations for Māori. There's no reason we shouldn't, and it's actually what we owe Māori. But it won't be easy, and we should be able to use the best and brightest to help us do that. If we can split the atom, despite what President Trump says, we can win the America's Cup, can create global companies like Xero, Zuru, Rocket Lab. We can do something like this. I don't know. We don't have the answers how, but I think it's something that we should take this crisis and turn it into a real opportunity. So those are just our thoughts at this stage.
Well, we've got some time for questions. Steve, Abel?
To answer your question, isn't it that Māori are doing it for themselves on an extraordinary scale? I mean, a booming Māori economy, and the biggest challenge is for these barriers to Māori self-determination to be got out of the way, because Māori will do it for themselves and are doing it for themselves. It's just that things like this Treaty Principles Bill are yet another example of the Crown putting a block and a barrier in the way of Māori self-determination.
Like 100% agree. I think there's probably equally other issues related to that, which we need to examine, including ownership of certain assets or areas and things like that. But unless we as a country have a goal that Māori shall be as well off as the rest of us, we won't even get those issues those self-determination issues pushed through. I mean, this bill's been a big demonstration on how the massive lack of education most Pākehā, including myself, had. Most people can't even talk about it because they don't know anything about it from a
Let's go
Pākehā.
to Rawari, final question.
Kia ora, tēnā koe, Mike. Thank you for your presentation. Just to add to the final comments you've just made in terms of people being uneducated here in Aotearoa around Te Tiriti o Waitangi, do you think it is fair that this is a national discussion as stipulated by David Seymour and the ACT Party, that he wants a national conversation and a democratic process to decide what the principles may look like if most of the country, as you have said, are uneducated in Te Tiriti o Waitangi? And what kind of justice does that provide this country in terms of true democracy, which would be one that is informed?
Yeah, look, I mean, 100% agree. I think that one of the things that no one has really put on the table or been honest about, this is wearing my old lawyer hat, is that you can't go and change contracts in terms of contracts like treaties without the other side's agreement. And if you try and do it and they say no, something like what was proposed is actually a fundamental breach of the treaty. And the treaty could be all over, which creates some of the biggest issues that anyone can face. And I think it's been quite sort of interesting that ACT in particular has avoided that whole question the whole way through, because it is a complete conflict with their desire to be seen to be the businessman's party, because they know in business, if you breach contracts, you get sued.
Thanks, Mike. You're going to have to cut you off a little bit.
Okay. Thanks.
But we're at the end of our time. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Members, our next submitter is Paula Greer, and we have her for 5 minutes.
Hello.
Kia ora, Paula. We can hear you, but we can't see you.
I don't know what's happened there.
Well, if you can't put your camera on, in the interest of time, we'll just crack into it. Oh, there you go. Paula, we've got you for 5 minutes to submit on the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi Bill. We'll get straight into it so we don't eat into any of that time. Be great to leave some time for questions. Over to you.
Okay. Kia ora, ko Paula tōku noa. All my grandparents were born in Scotland. One side, they both came out as young children. The other side, they came out as adults in their 30s and 50s. I grew up in Palmerston North, where they had bilingual radio back in the 1930s, and I currently live in Christchurch. In the meantime, I've lived in a huge range of towns in New Zealand, from less than 5% Māori to 95% Māori. I oppose this bill because basically by defining the principles, you're trying to lock in words in time, and words change, the meanings change all the time. I've studied the Te Tiriti in 5 different industries since the mid-1980s, which I know is very unusual. And each time it's looked at, it's dependent on the industry that you're using. So the words change and become relevant to that industry. I've seen the way the legislation's changed since it was agreed to: loss of land, loss of support structures, loss of mana, division of families, how most of it's been aimed at increasing value or contracts for non-Māori. And I think that's where they're trying to go with this one. That's all I have to say. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, we've got some time for questions, members. Let's go to Rawari first.
Kia ora, Paula. Nice to hear your presentation, and I'm sure the Scottish and the Māori can be agreeable on a few things when it comes to colonisation. Just reading your submission and just having a look at your variety of industry that you've worked in, and nursing is definitely one. In terms of the treaty principles, Bill, has there been equity or equality of Māori in the health system, from your point of view, in your professional opinion, when it comes to equitable and equal treatment in the health centre, in the health system?
Well, it's interesting because doing the training in Palmerston North, it was very much, could say Māori driven, respect, using two towels, one for the head, one for the body, learning the language, or at least the basics, the vowels, how to pronounce people's names correctly. Whereas coming down to Christchurch, moved down to Christchurch about 2 years got out of nursing, and it's like a different country. It's no Māori. Why would you bother with that? And even now, the few times I've had to do with the health industry in Christchurch, it's not even as close as it was in 1984, 85 when I was in it in Palmerston North. And it's just interesting seeing that huge difference. And it is lack of training, lack of knowledge, and it just shows how when management changes, their view comes in rather than being for the country and for the people that's involved.
Kia ora, Paula, thank you.
Kia ora, Paula, and we'll go now to Steve Abel.
Kia ora, Paula, thank you. Scotland represent. I actually just want to ask you about how cynical is it to use the general public ignorance of our history and general lack of understanding of Te Tiriti, which is a failure of us as a nation to teach people our history over generations, and to use it for political purposes in a means that divides us and sows fear amongst those who don't know the history and don't have an understanding of the importance of that founding agreement. What's your view of that in terms of those with political power using that, in such a manner?
A simple example is my daughter. She's 30. We lived in Taroa between when she was 2.5 till 3. So she went to Kohanga there because it was like 5 minutes walk, 5 days a week, rather than half an hour for 2 hours a week. And she did well. She wouldn't speak while we were there, but when we moved on to the next play centre, she would. By the time she was 7, she had learnt 7 languages or dialects because of where we'd been living. Now, in the last 5 years, she's been spouting, she got the council house because she's Marae. And that's purely because living in Christchurch and Nelson before that, and just the racism that is so inbuilt and inherited, because you're hearing this crap all the time from people. And if you're not taught it, and I've tried to talk about it, just the land loss thing, and she's like very against it.
Thanks for that, Paula. Annoying. Thank you for your answers. All right, we'll have to leave it there because we are out of time. But thanks very much for your submission, Paula. Thank you. Our next submitter members is Merita Levave, I think. Kia ora, Merita, good to see you. We've got you here for 5 minutes. Kia ora. So, look, I'll hand straight over to you in the interest of time. So, 5 minutes on the principles of the Treaty Waitangi Bill.
He honore he kororia ki te atua, he maungarongo ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tāngata katoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. I te taha o tōku whaia, he tangata tiriti ahau, he uri tēnei no England, no Ireland, no Scotland, no Germany hoki. I te taha o tōku matua, he tangata whenua ahau. Ko hikurangi te maunga, ko waiapu te awa, ko Ngati Parau Tiwi. I address you today as both tangata tiriti and tangata whenua. I also address you from my position as a kaiako at Newlands College. Joining me are colleagues, ākonga and mokopuna Māori, whose vocation, education and future are all impacted by the Treaty Principles Bill. Our faces and voices are present today to represent those whose whakapapa, indigeneity and unique connection to the whenua this bill attempts to erase and abandon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today and share our whakaaro on the Treaty Principles Bill. E ngā kai hautu, e ngā rangatira, we strongly oppose this bill. Toitu te tiriti. In 1864, Mary Jane Balbooth immigrated to New Zealand with her 3 children. She came from County Cavan in Ireland, fleeing heartbreak and trauma. Her husband, a local magistrate, was murdered in cold blood by the Molly Maguires while on his way home from church. Mary Jane turned to Aotearoa for refuge and is a safe haven for her young family. Mary Jane Balbooth is my tipuna. As a British citizen immigrating to New Zealand, the Treaty of Waitangi guaranteed Mary Jane and her whānau the same rights and duties of citizenship as the people of England by the Queen, but also the duty to live in a way that honoured tangata whenua and their taonga. Toitu te tiriti. In 1978, after a call from his uncle, Paula Levave got on a plane and left his family in Lalomango, Samoa, to take up a job at Todd Motors in Lower Hutt. He was promised more money working on an assembly line in the factory than what he was earning as a policeman in Samoa. Sure enough, when payday arrived, he had earned more in 2 weeks than what he would get in a month back home. Paula met his wife working at the hospital in Porirua, and they married, bought a house and raised their 5 children there. Paula Levave is my father-in-law and grandfather to my 2 children. As a Samoan citizen, he found a new home in Aotearoa that he believed could help him provide a better future for his children. He eventually became a New Zealand citizen. The Treaty of Waitangi again provided the guarantee for Paula and his family of the rights of British citizens with the same duty to live in a way that honours tangata whenua and their taonga. Toitu te tiriti. In 2007, I graduated from university and began my teaching career. The teaching code states that as teachers, we are committed to honouring te tiriti o Waitangi. In addition, the New Zealand curriculum specifically acknowledges the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi and the bicultural foundations of Aotearoa New Zealand. As a teacher, I am professionally mandated to honour, acknowledge and teach about the Treaty of Waitangi and its principles in their current original state. Toitu te tiriti. Aotearoa must be a place where the position of tangata whenua and taonga is protected. It must be a place where we welcome people who are seeking refuge, like my tipuna Mary Jane. It must be a place where we make room for those who seek a different future, like my father-in-law. It must be a place where our young people, like those you see before you today, can stand confidently in their identity as tangata tiriti or tangata whenua, all citizens of Aotearoa. For this to happen, we must uphold the tikanga of te tiriti. We must safeguard and protect the unique and special place of tangata whenua and our taonga by abandoning this bill. And by entrenching the Treaty of Waitangi and its principles. Toitu te tiriti.
Kia ora, Merita. Thank you for that submission, and can I just thank the people behind you, the staff and students, and say I think it's fantastic that you've got them all there having their say. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We don't have any time for questions, but once again, kia ora. Thank you. Members, our next submission is the Kotahitanga Te Atiawa Trust for 10 minutes.
Kia ora whānau.
That was
Korore ki te atua, maunga rongo ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa, aha koa no hea, aha koa no whea, no reira, tēnā koutou. Kia ora everybody, thank you for the opportunity to present on behalf of Te Kotahitanga o Te Atiawa, the post-settlement governance entity for Te Atiawa iwi here in Taranaki, and our 30,000 members. My name's Dion Tuta. I'm the Chief Executive of Te Kotahitanga o Te Atiawa. And I bring an apology from my chairperson, Liana Potu, who addressed you in her personal capacity earlier this morning. Te Atiawa iwi, a partner to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, by virtue of our tupuna who signed at Waikanae in May 1840. Te Kotahitanga o Te Atiawa is strongly opposed to this bill, and we recommend it proceed no further. I've got a few points to make in addition to the written submission we put through. So firstly, we find it ironic that a proposed piece of legislation called the Principles of the Treaty of Waitangi Bill does not include the actual principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. In case you've missed it, these principles are actually partnership, active participation, active protection, participation, and reasonable cooperation. I've read the bill from back to front and I don't see those anywhere within it. So this bill ignores 50 years of sophisticated and well-considered treaty jurisprudence developed by the higher courts, the Waitangi Tribunal itself, and previous governments. It seeks to reduce these to three libertarian ideas, which seeks to reduce the influence of the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand society without treaty partner engagement or consent, certainly not ours. In terms of the proposed principles themselves, principle number one reads as a mixture of fact and as yet unfulfilled aspiration, if not outright fiction. The proposed principle one states the executive government and parliament has the full power to govern and make laws. That's the fact part, in the interests of everyone. And that's the part that Māori could legitimately query. Because I'd note here actually that the proposed principle one does not actually require government to govern and make laws in the best interest of everyone. It just says they have the power to do so, which I suppose is handy for those in power, because the Taranaki Māori experience of government, of the state government, it demonstrates that governments do not necessarily make laws in the best interest of everyone, just the majority. And certainly in our case, the majority that wants your property. Taranaki Māori have suffered massive historical and ongoing injustices mandated by successive governments, which have had no respect for the guarantees of the Treaty of Waitangi or the rights and views of its minority Māori citizens. The bill seeks to repeat Chief Judge Prendergast's 1877 ruling that the treaty was a simple nullity, which could have no legal standing unless included in the law, but it proposes to go further than that and impose how any decision maker must interpret it. This bill seeks to require lawmakers and agents of the state to think and act like their 19th century predecessors, and I hope they refuse. The wisdom of those who developed the actual principles of the treaty over the last 50 years was their understanding that the power of the state sometimes requires tempering, and in the case of its treatment of Māori issues, a key element of that tempering has been the moral power of the actual principles of the Treaty of Waitangi to encourage those with power to act reasonably. The actual principles of partnership, active protection, participation, and reasonable cooperation have been value additive to our society, not detrimental, as proponents of this bill would have New Zealanders believe. The proposed principle 2 is an honest declaration of the proponent's view that Māori will not be allowed to have any different rights unless it is at the sufferance of the majority. This reinforces the earlier point that I made about New Zealand being a basic majoritarian democracy. It also ignores the reality that the treaty affirmed pre-existing Māori rights, which settlers did not have, while also granting Māori the additional rights of British citizens. The proposed principle 3, equality before the law, should be true in Aotearoa, but it is not. History demonstrates it is not. National statistics demonstrate it is not. National statistics place Māori at the bottom rung of nearly every social indicator. Life is harder for some here, and it's easier for some, not because of some natural order, not because of some inherent flaw within Māori people, but because of deliberate past actions which have privileged some and disadvantaged others, codified within the law. This fact sits in the background of our lives as New Zealanders, so that most people don't even notice it, and some wouldn't even accept this to be true, even if it was pointed out to them. But everything has a whakapapa, and everything traces its origins to something. This bill thrives on the national ignorance New Zealand has about its own past, due to the fact that New Zealand history has never been really taught in our education system, an issue that's been covered here earlier before. Another intergenerational government decision which has led us to today. So as members of the Taranaki Māori community, We don't see the case for change being well made on this matter. We don't see the rationale for this issue being given the priority and urgency it seems to be accorded. We certainly see a case for priority on issues such as poverty, homelessness, and the housing crisis, the health sector crisis, the cost of living crisis. I don't see my fellow citizens living on the street because they lack clarity over the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. I don't see my fellow citizens waiting weeks for a doctor's appointment, complaining that they're unsure which principle of the treaty they should be trying to apply when trying to get an appointment. So I question the priority of this issue within our parliamentary decision-making processes at this time. As a member of a community which has suffered the worst of government action, but is seeking to forgive and move into a more positive post-settlement reality, ironically based on promises made by the Crown to act as a better treaty partner, this bill again presents the Crown as something hostile to who we are. Whether intentionally or not, this bill is having the effect of undermining the Māori goodwill and desire to move past grievance by elevating a false narrative of Māori privilege which must be shut down through the vehicle of this bill. Te Kotahitanga o te Atiawa urges the Justice Committee to see the injustice of what this bill proposes and recommend it go no further. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Dion. Thank you for leaving some time for questions, members. Does anyone have a question? Steve?
Oh,
And then is that you too, Rawiri? Okay,
Yes,
we'll go to Steve first, then Rawiri.
Kia ora. Thank you. It's a very thorough and excellently articulated submission. Very much, Dion. What's your view of the conversation around where the principles fit in the context of the actual text of Te Tiriti? Part of the conversation we have is that they've been developed through the 50 years of jurisprudence, and you seem to have a strong sort of view that they're solid and we should treat them as sort of in the spirit of overarching conceptual embodiment of what Te Tiriti was seeking to achieve. Can you expand on your views on that at all?
Yeah, okay, I'll give it a go. I think my key point, I guess, is that the principles that I view, the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi have been developed by experts who have had deep knowledge of this kaupapa. And I think what they've been trying to do is reconcile the text, the reality of the actual text of the actual treaty itself with the reality of the world we live in now. Because a lot of water has gone under the bridge since 1840. And when those principles were first articulated by the courts and against the land, as part of the lands case and all of those issues back in the sort of mid-1980s, there was a realization that, well, you can't turn the clock back to 1840. You can't start again, but you have to have some kind of consideration in a way which elevates the intent of the original treaty. So I think the principles. So and one of the earlier speakers talked about how nothing freezes in time, things evolve. But the thing that should hopefully freeze in time is that we should be, as New Zealanders, as Māori New Zealanders, non-Māori New Zealanders, tangata tiriti, tangata whenua, reasonable towards one another and reasonable and have consideration towards one another's views rather than just putting up a hand and saying, nah, your view doesn't matter, only mine does.
Kia ora, Dion. I'm going to go to Rawiri now, just in the interest of time.
Kia ora, Dion. Otira, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. And just to acknowledge the settlement in Parliament last week around Taranaki Maunga and the recognition of the breaches when it comes to the atrocities that Taranaki faced in the early years of settlement. Hey, look, I know Te Atiawa is a PSG, and in your experience in that particular space, where those who probably don't understand and the ignorance around treaty settlement process is that Te Atiawa, like many other, we would have got 1% of its total due. And if you look at the total settlement and settlements across the country since its inception have only received $2.6 billion, where tax cuts for the rich. In terms of, they got $2.9 billion. So can you just tell me how the treaty principles bill in its explanation that everybody is treated equally actually plays out when actually the reality doesn't look like that at all?
Yeah, Again, I think it all comes back, it's playing on the false narrative that Māori are somehow privileged. And it ties into that point that other speakers have made today around New Zealanders are generally ignorant of all of this stuff, right? When they find out about some of the things that New Zealand governments have inflicted on Māori society, and the person who spoke from the Kiwis for the treaty and his understanding of how structural inequality has been built in this nation by basically the virtue of transfer of wealth from Māori to non-Māori through government-mandated processes. Now, the people who have that wealth, they might not actually know that. They might not know how it's come to them. And nobody wakes up in the morning wanting to feel guilty about how they live, right? And because everybody wants to think, I've managed to achieve this by my own two hands. And they have, right, by and large. But that achievement, by and large, in New Zealand has been based on that opportunity being taken from somebody else, often against their will.
Kia ora, Dion.
So it fundamentally comes back to ignorance about our history and willful ignorance in some parts.
Kia ora, Dion. Thank you for that. And I didn't mean to cut you off, but we're pretty much over time there. So kia ora for your submission. Members, I would ask you to try and keep those questions a bit more, kia ora, a bit more concise, because it does mean we're running behind, particularly if we give submitters a fair opportunity to respond to them. We've now got Katherine Duncan as a submitter, and she's going to submit for 5 minutes.
I'm just going to step out, Mr. Chair, and Hannah's taking my place.
Kia ora. Thank you, Steve.
Right. Thank you, everyone.
Just got some technical issues with Katherine, but hopefully she'll be with us very shortly.
Hello.
Oh, kia ora, Katherine. We can hear you. Can't quite see you yet, but if
Trying to start my video, but it seems to be blank.
Okay. Well, look, that's all right. We've got the main thing, which is your voice.
Thank you.
Katherine, we've got you for 5 minutes. So without further ado, we'll just get straight into it and hand over to you to make your submission.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I support the bill, but as per the steps outlined in my recommendations taken as read, I'll just speak to 3 points in my submission. 1, the various English versions of the treaty and the Littlewood final draft. 2, the official English version in use by the Waitangi Tribunal. And 3, the Kohimarama Conference 1860. Te Tiriti o Waitangi, written in Māori, was signed at Waitangi on the 6th of February 1840. Nationwide, it was signed by over 500 chiefs. Te Tiriti was the only document signed by the chiefs. It should therefore be the reference point for all issues arising from it. Some history on the treaty. There were multiple rough drafts and notes made in the preparation for the translation into Māori, but none accurately reflected Te Tiriti. It would seem the final draft for Te Tiriti had been lost. Then, in 1989, a further draft of the treaty was discovered by the Littlewood family when sorting through deceased estate documents. This has become known as the Littlewood Treaty, dated 1840, written in James Busby hand, and is almost certainly the final draft used by Reverend Henry Williams when translating Te Tiriti on the 4th and 5th of February. The Littlewood final draft is at the Turnbull Library, but it's not on display with all the other treaty documents and other drafts and notes. Why? It is practically identical with back translations from Māori to English. There's a watermark that identifies it, and it's identical with the copy that Clendon forwarded to the States. I would call it the inconvenient truth I recommend the Littlewood final draft should be brought to the light, ratified, and replace the current official English version. There is more detail in Martin Dutrat's book, The Littlewood Treaty, and online. Now, the official English version of the treaty. In background, a formal royal-style version of the treaty was prepared in 1840 and sent to England by Hodgson's secretary, James Freeman. This cobbled together and inaccurate version includes reference to forest and fisheries. This is not in Te Tiriti, which simply refers to properties. In 1975, this version with forests and fisheries somehow replaced the official English version, a back translation from Māori. In the 80s, the word treasures was somehow added to the properties guaranteed in Article 2, thus allowing a considerable extension of possible claims. And I'm just adding something here. In fact, the back translation of the second article accurately reads, "The Queen of England arranges and agrees to give to the chiefs, the hapus, and all the people of New Zealand the full chieftainship of their lands, their settlements, and their property." Emphasis, all the people of New Zealand. You can see it for yourself. In the 80s, the word treasures was added. This calls the legal basis, in my mind, of the tribunal decisions into question. I recommend the official English version should be the Littlewood version and reinstate the back translation from Māori in the meantime. It would help to clear up a lot of current problems. Finally, I would draw your attention to the Kohimarama Conference, 1860, held in Auckland, 20 years after signing the treaty. In his opening address, Governor Brown reminded the chiefs that New Zealand was the first country colonised with a treaty. This was a new, different and humane system with the aim to benefit Māori and to live together in unity, all as British citizens. He listed some of the benefits. Cannibalism has been exchanged for Christianity. Slavery has been abolished. War has become more rare. Prisoners taken in war are not slain. This was all about Māori people. Here's a typical quote by a chief at the meeting, as recorded in the Māori Messenger newspaper. There are many of them. When the missionaries arrived, they saw that many of us were in the depths of misery. Some were bound by the chains of the enemy, and some were devouring one another. The first shadow of the Queen spread over me was Christianity. This is the chain that has held me and caused me to give up my evil customs. I live in peace, happiness, and goodwill. I would not return to cannibalism of our Māori ancestors. A final word.
Katherine, your time's up there, so I just wanted to thank you for your submission. And unfortunately, we've got no time for questions, so we'll have to move on. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. And after that presentation, I will remove myself from here. Maria Mena will take over.
Thank you, Warari. Members, our next...
I didn't get my last line in. Fumbled at the last hurdle.
The next submitter is Alvina Edwards, and we have Alvina for 5 minutes.
Can you see me?
Not yet, but we can now. Kia ora, Alvina. Thank you for being on this subcommittee of the Justice Committee. We've got you for 5 minutes. In the interest of time, I'll hand straight over to you. Kia ora.
Honourable members of the Select Committee, tēnā koutou. Waitaha kati mā moi kati ere ki hu kaitahua hau. I take my submission as read and speak directly to my position. Politics under this coalition is not about leadership, but about accommodating political deceit. They manufacture problems, misdiagnose them and push the wrong solutions, all while pretending they are acting in the nation's best interest. David Seymour's coalition government embody David Seymour and the coalition government embodied this deception with the Treaty of Principles Bill. They twist history, manipulate public perception, disguise their agenda as clarification. They think their game is hidden, but we see it, we live it, and so do the many victims of the ACT Party. It is exhausting to witness this false narrative rise from the ashes, driven solely by political motives. I firmly oppose the Treaty Principles Bill introduced by the ACT Party leader David Seymour, which seeks to rewrite the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi within New Zealand law. The bill is not required, and it is imperative to highlight the significant concerns about the imprudence of Seymour's interpretation of tikana and his presumption of knowing what is best for all New Zealanders. David Seymour has frequently emphasised the importance of upholding tikana within parliamentary procedures. For example, the tikana of this House is well known and must and should be respected. However, there are unresolved matters involving his previous party president and other allegations that raise serious questions about his adherence to these principles. The inconsistency undermines the integrity and trust in our political institutions. Treaty Principles Bill David Seymour proposes are 3 core principles: civil government, property rights, equal rights, ensures that all New Zealanders are equal under the law with the same rights and duties. While these principles are presented as trying to deceitfully provide clarity and certainty, they do not achieve what Seymour claims. It is crucial to address the broader implications and the audacity of Seymour's attempt to rewrite our founding document. Key points to consider: accountability and transparency. All political figures, including David Seymour, must be held accountable for their actions and those of their affiliates. The unresolved matters involving his past and present party representatives cast shadows of doubt on his commitment to the principles he advocates. Seymour's actions and those of his parties should align with the standards they profess to uphold, but these inconsistencies highlight a significant lack of integrity. Respect for tikana. True respect for tikana involves a deep and consistent commitment to principles, values, and customs. Seymour's selective application of tikana to suit his political agenda is deeply concerning. Genuine respect for tikana requires continuous and sincere adherence, not just when it is politically convenient. The selective application undermines the very essence of tikana. Public trust. Maintaining public trust in our institution necessitates transparency and accountability. The unresolved matter should be subject to a thorough and public review to preserve the credibility of political leaders and processes. This is especially crucial and critical when proposing significant legislation like the Treaty Principles Bill, where public trust is paramount. Consistency in legislation. The current principles in our founding document, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, reflect a genuine, unwavering commitment to principles they promote. The Treaty Principles Bill drawn by Seymour is found to act in consistency with our founding document and principles. It is fundamentally undermines the bill's credibility and the public's trust in its intentions. The shamelessness of assuming one-size-fits-all approach to tikana and to Te Tiriti is both misguided and dismissive of the comprehensive realities faced by Māori. In the light of these concerns, I strongly urge the Select Committee to reject the Treaty Principles Bill and consider an internal, external, full inquiry into all the matters I have raised. Let us ensure that the values we legislate are consistently upheld by those who advocate for them. David Seymour's strong statements on upholding tikana and the rule of law is entirely reasonable to hold him accountable for any inconsistencies in his actions and those of his parties. Addressing these issues, especially in the context of significant legislation like the proposed Treaty Principles Bill and Regulatory Standards Bill, is crucial for maintaining transparency and integrity in political discourse. History will judge the Select Committee. Māori will not forget. And a message to David, I just want to include a message to David Seymour. Your worst sin is that you have destroyed and betrayed yourself for nothing. History will not remember you kindly. Questions?
No time for questions. You've gone over time already, but thank you for your
Okay.
submission, Alvina. Kia ora, thank you very, very much.
Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Kia ora. Okay, that's good. Kia ora, members. We've now got the Pacific Youth Leadership and Transformation Council Charitable Trust for 10 minutes. Riki, familiar face on select committees. Good to see you. You know how it works. I'm going to hand straight over to you. Kia ora.
Yeah, whakalofa lahi atu matolo osi, ko hingo haku ko Riki Welsh. It's an honour today to speak on behalf of the Pacific Youth Leadership and Transformation Trust, PYLAT. Whoop whoop. We're a small charity of volunteers whose vision is to see a world well informed and influenced by Pacific young people, and we empower Pacific youth to participate in democracy. One way we do that is by gathering the opinions of Pacific people, collating them into submissions and submitting them to anyone that's willing to listen to us, including Parliament. For example, this is our third verbal submission in the past 7 months. We're serial complainants. When representing these views, we don't offer a technical, historical, or legal opinion. What we present to you are views of ordinary Pacifica Kiwis who don't all have the same opinion. So as I summarise our submission, it's important to note that we do not speak for the Pacifica community. Our conclusions are drawn from the balance of opinion of the community that we talked to. 104 people who filled out our survey, half of whom were under 30, and this is who I refer to when I say our community. This submission presents the majority opinion, but I must emphasize the absolute mana of the voices of those who were in the minority. Every one of their thoughts and opinions have been included in the written submission as well. All voices matter. Firstly, we address the way in which this conversation has been had. Only 11% of our community felt that this was the right way to have this conversation. Deciding on 3 principles, passing them in the first reading of Parliament, and then asking people, what do you think about it, is not the way that you have a conversation or a talanoa. It's probably for this reason that politicians are not trusted by our community with this discussion, with only 6% of our community saying that politicians should be left to interpret Te Tiriti. 84% of us found no. And we didn't think this was the right thing to do. So we said, who then should support the treaty? Or should interpret Te Tiriti? And slightly more, 20% felt that it was the courts, whilst 54% of our community believed that the findings from the Waitangi Tribunal should be binding. So if anything, it should be left to them. The next thing that I would say in regards to this conversation is that 80% of our community felt that New Zealand as a whole is not informed enough to have a meaningful discussion on this. 2/3 of our community felt that they did not receive sufficient education at school on the Treaty of Waitangi, and more than half of them were not confident or feeling informed enough to speak about Te Tiriti. We believe proper education is needed, and if the government is serious about a national conversation on Te Tiriti, then they should invest in that education. We take our privilege to vote seriously, and we do not want to be uninformed voters. So let's have the conversation and education properly first before we show up to the polls. In regards to the first proposed principle of the bill, that Parliament and government have full power to govern, 67% of our community felt that Māori did not cede sovereignty when they signed the bill. We therefore cannot support a principle that is not derived from the Māori version of Te Tiriti and believe it should be abandoned. If you want to make laws that say Parliament and government have full power, go ahead, but don't do it under the guise of a treaty principle. Proposed principle 2, saying that Māori will only have different rights if recognised in a treaty settlement, is not something that we believe to be true. 62% of us believe that Māori have different rights as tangata te whenua and have a right to self-determination that we do not. And this doesn't need to be stated in a treaty settlement. Interestingly, our community did not think it's divisive to state that Māori have different rights to non-Māori, with only 15% feeling this way. 48% of our community, however, felt it causes division when we go around saying all New Zealanders have equal rights. So on the balance of opinion, principle 2 is not consistent with our view of reality, so we believe it should be abandoned. Regarding proposed principle 3, that we are all exactly equal with the same rights, we asked our community, do we think we should just disregard what the treaty says and instead say we're all just equal? 63% said no. Of course, being treated equal before the law is important, but we are smart enough to know it is nuanced, and we see different examples of different treatment every day. People with a driver's license have the right to drive a car that non-license holders don't. People who hold a legal title to land enjoy that land in a way that non-title holders don't. And people who have a signed treaty with the government have the right to self-determination that those without a treaty don't. That is equal treatment in effect already. We do not need this principle. I now speak about the Pacifica community. Our community felt that Pacifica people should not remain neutral in this conversation. We need to be strong in our support of Māori, and what being strong in support of them means by our survey says that 19% support the bill, while 64% are against this bill. Again, I acknowledge those with a minority opinion. I don't believe that this was the right way to have the conversation. And I think, call me optimistic, if we did it properly, I believe as a country, we could get to 95, maybe 99% agreement on a solution. But that isn't going to happen using a politicized process like this. Therefore, for the sake of unity, the Treaty Principles Bill should be rejected at its first opportunity. Whakawalahi, whawhataitele lava, thank you for your time.
Thank you for that, Riki. Members, we've got time for questions. If anyone has a question for Riki, Huhana Linden.
Tēnā koe, Riki, e mihi atu ana kia koe mō wēnei kōrero I tēnei ahiahi. First of all, wanting to share with you a mihi of thanks for bringing Pacific Youth Voice to the table. I wanted to ask about how you gather that voice and how you are feeling the voice from your community, because you've recognised in your submission that you do have minority voices, but ultimately has the Treaty Principles Bill brought a wider awareness of the fact that treaty education is required in New Zealand?
We already had an awareness that treaty education was needed before the Treaty Principles Bill. In 2010, we created what we called the PYLAT communique and submitted that to Parliament, stating such facts. We participated in the New Zealand Constitution conversation, where we said that the Treaty of Waitangi was important. And in 2017, Pacific young people passed the Pacific Youth Parliament Bill Act 2017. It's hosted on the parliamentary website, stating that the treaty is important. We already know it's an important conversation. We didn't need to have this bill come forward for us to talk about te tiriti.
Kia ora. Well, if there's no other questions, we'll leave it there. But Riki, thank you once again for submitting to Parliament for Pacifica Rangatahi. It's really good to see you. So kia ora. Thank you.
Ka kite.
Members, we now have Steve Chadwick for 10 minutes.
Tēnā tātou katoa, na mihi nui kia koutou, and thank you for giving me the time. Oh,
Kia ora, Steve, we can't see you yet, which is a loss.
well, I'm saying start my video.
Oh, there you go. Kia ora.
Right.
You know how this works. We've got you for 10 minutes. I'm going to hand straight over to you. Kia ora.
Or tēnā tātou katoa, na mihi nui kia koutou, and it's wonderful to follow Riki and hear the voices that have come before you this morning. And thanks for listening to us on this particular bill. Look, I'm really saddened that I'm here today, but it's the democratic process, and I feel we've got to participate in this process on this dreadful legal and philosophical fiction that we're facing before us today. So I'm deeply saddened that a major party allowed this minority party to lead this national conversation. But, you know, some good will come of this conversation, and I trust you as a select committee that you will put forward that strength to government today. I'm going to give you not a technical treatise of what the principles are and what I see them as in this bill, but I'm going to give you my learned experience and my life experience. I've been lucky enough to be a bicultural couple who together advocated for equity and justice in New Zealand, because both of us experienced overt racism and inequity in our lives for the last 60 years. My husband John set up the Māori Law Society with erudite legal wisdom with Sir Joe Williams, Morna Jackson, Annette Sykes, and many others that supported taking on the system and making sure that Māori lawyers had their say. And I tautoko the Te Hungaroia submission before you. But I also understood the importance of the reo and the language. And John and I set up the first kohanga reo in Rotorua, Te Kotu, and we've seen the flourishing and hear the voices now that speak so well of the New Zealand that we want to see. So I say we've got this wonderful Waitangi Tribunal. The Waitangi Tribunal will listen to and change as an iterative process what the principles of the treaty should be. I started bicultural education and health in the District Health Board over 50 years ago. And we talked about the principles that we understood very simply about participation of diverse voices, partnership and protection. That's what we understood. And we keep it simple until we get a challenge like this, which is probably going to be quite healthy for New Zealand, really. I think, though, that the issue that we're facing is that current statistics show that we haven't anywhere near addressed inequity in our society. Why? Why, for our children, have we undone great systems that were proposed in health, like Te Akawhai Hauora? Why have we attacked the reo, which we fought so hard to establish over 50 years ago? Why are our incarceration rates so poor? Well, I want to give you now an example of having been a proud mayor of Rotorua for 12 years after I was an MP. We forged a partnership with Atiawa. That wasn't easy. We stood up against hatred, lack of understanding about what a partnership could deliver, but we did it because we were brave and we knew it was the right thing to do. We signed that partnership agreement at Taumata Kapua in 2015. Now I want to tell you a couple of things that we achieved, and that's what we can achieve when we work together as tangata whenua and tangata tiriti. We achieved massive roading shifts because we lifted a designation that was harmful to hapu. We've delivered drinking water, fresh drinking water to our township because we worked with Ngati Rangawewahi and Judge Bidwar led that with Honourable Chris Finlayson dealing with the treaty settlement. And now our community is enjoying fresh drinking water forever. I wear today this wonderful ahurai gifted from Ngati Rangawewahi, and I wear it close to my heart because when you work together in partnership, you can achieve wonderful things. It's so simple, really. Then we looked at sewage systems for our community, and we had to work with the hapu most affected to actually get reticulated sewage systems to protect our water. So that involved having governance at the table and having the right people from the hapu affected to work alongside us. And that's what Te Tātou or Te Arawa actually achieved. And then we tackled the interesting thorny issue of governance. And we had agreement to set up a Māori ward so quickly that can be undone at the next election with a referendum. We tried an electoral representation bill, and we failed on that. So you keep trying when you're a strong, brave leader. I remember one thing that has changed so much when we had iwi at the table beside us in a real and enduring partnership. Our language changed. Our language changed, and we all enjoyed working together and understanding the benefits that could ensue. We talked about mokopuna decisions, and I see afterwards Whakaue are coming before you, and you'll hear more about mokopuna decisions. So we're saying it's not about us anymore. It's actually about our children. And the diversity that I saw on the treaty march was absolutely heartwarming and hugely emotional because all cultures came out to say this bill is appalling and must go. So We faced bravery and we faced hatred. And we had some outstanding councillors dumped at the next election. So quickly through the political process, things can change. What we want to achieve out of this is to give that mana back to our children, all of our children, so that they understand how to work together, so that they have a sense of self-worth. This conversation that we're currently having, some good has to come of it. And I heard Dame Jenny Shipley yesterday, and I thought, go you. You know, you've learned over this process of the value of working together. It's going to be brave leadership needed by our Prime Minister and Cabinet to say this bill must be dumped. We're beside you if you deliver that brave leadership. We can do great things when we work together. So that's the perspective and the background that I wanted to share. Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you, Steve. I see Maria Mano Kapakingi has a question, so let's go to her.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Stevie, tēnā koe, kānui te mihi kia koe. You would have seen, as much of our country and the world saw, was the act of turning the back. Ngā puhi turn their back on Seymour's speech. What do you make of that? In light of everything that you know and experience and you've developed yourselves, you and your darling, what do you make of that?
I think it was a dignified process of saying to him, we don't like what you're doing. We don't like the philosophical fiction that you're proposing in this bill. We do not support it. We're here. They're probably listening. They're going. But to just turn quietly. It is the mana of iwi that actually teaches us all about how we can work together. And they showed that yesterday.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Kia ora, we have Huhana Linden.
Kia ora whai, Stevie. Mihi ana kia koe, because I wanted to explore really the council iwi Māori relationship in Te Arawa is quite unique. Now, it's not without its challenges, but is there learning within that experience and your journey to date that all New Zealanders could benefit from?
Absolutely. I think the learning is that there's not one rule that fits all, actually, Huhana. We did it the Te Arawa way, the Rotorua way. Te Arawa came to us and asked for an enduring partnership. And so we had a good look around the motu of what that might look like. And Te Tātou was born from that, going around the motu to see what they wanted. And it was to sit at the table. It wasn't hard. And we were quite timid when I look back, because they didn't sit at the full council table. They sat at the subcommittees of council that made recommendations to full council. But full council, by learning the process of participation at the committee meeting table, didn't overturn one decision. So, you know, we learned, and that's what I mean about it being an iterative process. When you come together, take the challenge, actually question your response that might have been your response, your subjective response, and then go, no, but we've learned actually the richness. And I remember one of our submitters saying, and I won't name him, but he said, what's good for iwi is good for everyone.
Kia ora.
We're here forever, and as politicians, you come and go. We've got to do the right thing.
Kia ora, Steve. Thank you for your submission. Our time is up, but thank you for taking the effort.
Take the lead. Ka kite.
Ka kite. Members, our next submitter isn't available, so we're moving on to Rapua Whaioranga.
Can you hear us?
Lee Morris, Rapua Whaioranga. Yes, we can. We can see you there. We've set aside 5 minutes to hear from you. So I'm just going to hand straight over to you in the interests of time. Kia ora.
Hi, kia ora. Thank you for giving us this opportunity, by the way. Ko Lee Morris ahau, he uri o Te Arawa, he kanohi mō Rapua Whaioranga, he rōpū Māori, e mahi ana ki te hāpai i te hauora hine ngaro o ngā whānau i tamaki ki te tonga. As a Māori kaimahi in mental health, we see firsthand the impact of colonisation on our people, mistrust in services and whakamā in seeking help, the intergenerational trauma that is carried by whānau. Te tiriti o Waitangi is not just a political agreement to us. It is the foundation of trust and the framework that allows us to advocate for culturally safe, for whānau-centred solutions and for services that uphold mana rather than diminish it. This bill does the exact opposite. It weakens the very commitments that were made in 1840. It attempts to redefine te tiriti in a way that services only the Crown's interest, ignoring the lived realities of our Māori communities. It uses the rhetoric of equality to erase the distinct status of tangata whenua, reducing our tino rangatiratanga to what the Crown decides is acceptable. That is not partnership. This is not honouring te tiriti. The impact of this bill will not just be theoretical, it will be felt. In our work, we see how legislative decisions translate into real-life harm. Policies that ignore Māori voices lead to services that do not work for Māori. Systems that dismiss our rights lead to poorer health, education, and economic outcomes for our people. This will contribute to that harm. I stand before you today not just as a health kaimahi, but as a Māori, deeply concerned about the ongoing erosion of te tiriti o Waitangi. We have seen what happens when laws are made without Māori voices at the table, and the history shows us the devastating impact on such decisions. This bill is not the first time the Crown has sought to redefine te tiriti to suit its own purposes. We have seen this pattern before, where laws are passed in the name of progress or equality, but instead strip Māori of rights, culture, and tino rangatiratanga. Let me remind the committee to some of the past laws and the harm they caused. The Lunatics Ordinance 1846 enabled Māori to be institutionalised in asylums at alarming rates, often for behaviours that were cultural rather than medical. Whānau were stripped of our ability to care for their own, and the Māori perspectives on mental well-being were dismissed. The effects of the system are still visible today in the overrepresentation of Māori in mental health services. The Tohunga Suppression Act 1907 criminalised traditional Māori healing and spiritual practices, forcing Māori to rely on Western medicine, which often failed to serve us well. It disconnected Māori from our own knowledge systems and healing practices, practices that we are still working to reclaim today in our mahi with whānau. The Suppression of Rebellion Act 1863. This law labelled Māori who resisted land confiscations as rebels and allowed the Crown to seize vast amounts of whenua. The generational impacts of land loss are directly linked to the disparities we see today: displacement, poverty, and the erosion of our cultural and economic foundations. Every one of these laws was justified at the time as being necessary or for the good of the country. This Treaty Principles Bill follows that same dangerous path. It is presented as a way to bring clarity to the treaty, but in reality, it is about controlling how the treaty is interpreted, limiting Māori rights to what the Crown alone decides is acceptable. The question this committee must ask itself is this: what would this bill be another chapter in the long history of laws that have harmed Māori? Or will you choose a different path, one of true partnership, of honouring the commitments made in 1840 and of ensuring a just future for all? We urge you to listen to the voices across the motu, to the finding of the Waitangi Tribunal, and to the real-life experiences of those working in our communities. Do not proceed with this bill. Instead, commit in upholding te tiriti in its true intent, as a living agreement that requires partnership, protection, and participation, not political interpretation. Toi tu te tiriti.
Kia ora, Leah. Thank you for your submission, and thank you for the work that you're doing in Counties Manukau as well. So we haven't actually got time for questions, but thank you for your submission. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Members, the next submitter is the one we discussed just straight after lunch. Te Atiawa ki Whakarongotai Marae Waikanae. All right, I see we've got Rawari there. Rawari, if you can switch your camera and microphone on, that would be great. Kia ora, Rawari. Welcome to the committee. We've set aside 10 minutes to hear from you on the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi Bill. In the interest of time, I'll hand straight over. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Ko kapa nui te maunga teitei, ko Waikanae te awaroa, ko te rau te rangi te moana, ko kapati te motu tapu, ko Tokamaru te waka, ko Whakarongotai te marae, ko te Atiawa te iwi, ko Rawiri tāwhai Bosworth tuku ingoa, ngā mihi nui koutou katoa. Ko au te tumuaki o Atiawa ki Whakarongotai Charitable Trust. I am here with our tumu whakarai, CEO Frank Hippolyte. I take our trust submission as read by the committee. As you can see, we as a iwi are fundamentally opposed to this bill, and we're fundamentally opposed to any further progress of this bill through Parliament. There's two key points that I want to reiterate out of our submission. Firstly, we are appalled with the complete lack of iwi consultation in the development of this bill. We consider the select community process a public feedback process. It is not consultation with tangata whenua under Te Tiriti. It is not acknowledgement of our rangatiratanga o mana motuhake as under Te Tiriti. We are treated as a stakeholder, not the Crown's Te Tiriti partner. It is a Crown-dominated process, and the lack of consultation is just another breach of Te Tiriti, as highlighted by the tribunal. Secondly, we are a pre-settlement iwi, and as such, the draft bill, whilst offering minimal recognition of iwi that have settled with the Crown, leaves the likes of our iwi settlement open to the whims and any flow-on impacts, minimising our settlement redress of Te Tiriti breaches under this bill, if it went forward. Supposedly it's not. As such, it is a discriminatory bill towards iwi, such as ours, achieving agreed redress, thus again further breaching the Crown's obligation under Te Tiriti. Lastly, we are appalled that this bill has made it this far. We are appalled with the leadership of the current Prime Minister in enabling this bill to get this far. His enabling of a minority partner to race bait, gaslight, misinform the public with the bill and their misrepresentations is appalling. This, coupled with the numerous legislative and policy setting changes that have wound back decades of tangata whenua gains, is very telling of possibly an underlying strategy of a great windback of tangata whenua, tino rangatira mana motuhake under Te Tiriti. The proposed regulatory standards bill seeks to ignore tangata whenua altogether. I say shame on this government's leadership. I say shame on the Prime Minister. As tūmamaki of our iwi, I want it noted that I will be agitating for our people to remove this government at the next election, removing what I perceive, or what many of us perceive, as an underlying racist agenda that breaches Te Tiriti and the binding agreement between the Crown and tangata whenua. Nō reira, I'm open to questions.
Oh, kia ora, thank you for that. Members, are there questions for Rawiri? Maramino.
Kia ora, Mr. Chair. Rawiri, tēnā rā hoki koe. I can see your theme, you're driving to the point that the PM hasn't done his job, yes. So what, but you also made the remark, supposedly it's not going through. What else are you saying in that particular remark? When you say supposedly, you've obviously heard somewhere, you know, like, what are you hearing and what are your people telling you?
Well, look, one thing I have heard through our connections is that there was overwhelming support in this process, this select committee process. Overwhelming opposition, as I believe 91% to about 9%. However, that's not made transparent, and I don't know why. And as one of the iwi chairs, and as the iwi chairs, we're asking why. Why isn't that made transparent? Why wouldn't you make that transparent, which further supports the removal of this bill going forward? So that's why I say supposedly the Prime Minister is making statements left, right, and centre that they won't support the second reading. supposedly.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Kia ora, thank you. And Huhana, we have a question from you.
Tēnā koe te matua Rawere, o tira tēnā koe e te matua Frank, e mihi kau atu ana kia koe mai te taitokiro. I wanted to explore with you in thinking about where you sit within the motu as well, and that alliance of our tribes in Te Upoko Tika, and how it must impact, I guess, we've been regular in the last 12 to 18 months in mobilising submissions and response to various pieces of legislation. Do you think that, this process in particular, and acknowledging 300,000 plus submissions were submitted just on this piece of legislation, that it's actually quite tiresome for our community? It's tiresome and we're getting submission fatigue. And so, is this a fair process for us to have to continue to respond in this way?
Tēnā koe, Huhana. Look, it's a reactive process, isn't it? It's a reactive response. It's not a strategic, it's not a partnership moving together forward. We're constantly in reactive mode, addressing various bits of legislation and policy settings that impact our people. Is it tiring? Well, I think it's actually energized us in more in terms of the Kotahitanga of our people. It is a burden, but it's one we will embrace, and we will embrace and move forward with always on behalf of our people.
Kia ora. And I see we have a question from Rima Nakle.
Kia ora. Look, thank you for your submission. Just reiterating that our Prime Minister has said that we're not moving forward with this from our part. So just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Rima. Look, I have a question, if I may. You mentioned that you're a pre-settlement iwi, and that's something that I think is worth discussing, because the Crown Māori relationship and post-settlement entities can be, well, at least it's down in black and white in the settlement deed or the settlement legislation. Can you just discuss what the principles as they are currently understood mean in terms of your relationship with the Crown and how the Crown has obligations to you as an iwi?
Look, I think we say it in our submission. We as an iwi view Te Tiriti as a binding agreement between the Crown and tangata whenua. As such, in Te Tiriti, the principles are very clear that our rangatiratanga, our mana motuhake is maintained, and that they will work with us under that binding agreement in partnership. Principles-wise, that means when there's redress to our Tiriti claims, they will treat that with that same respect within that article of the Te Tiriti.
Kia ora. Thank you for that. I think we've got time for one more question from Huhana.
Yeah, can I just supplement on that? I wanted to follow up because part of the Treaty Principles Bill proposes that, and actually limits maybe, iwi Māori voice to only what settled iwi might have negotiated. So, do you believe that the limitation of the embodiment and the responsibility and obligations of Te Tiriti are just limited to a settlement agreement, or is it enduring?
It's enduring, Huhana. Kyle is settlement, and it should be enduring. It has to be based on endurance, because as we know, some of those settlements will grow as other settlements are achieved. So it's an enduring, binding agreement and redress process.
Kia ora, Raweri. Frank, thanks for coming on today. I think we're about done, but a really useful submission. Thanks for your time, and thanks for coming onto this committee. Kia ora. Members, our next submitter is Sara Cole-Stratton, who's with us for 5 minutes. Kia ora, Sara. Welcome to the Justice Subcommittee. We've got you for 5 minutes to submit on the Treaty Principles Bill, and I'll hand straight over to you. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Ngati hini rawa ko Ngati kahu o kuiwi, he moko puna o tau rekereke rawa ko Hera Hinare, ko Sara Cole-Stratton, ahau, straight to it. We do not need nor want this bill. One of its purposes was to unify. Te Tiriti o Waitangi has been the best example in history of what unity is and how it can be achieved. This bill has done the opposite. It has divided and instilled fear and hate. How can anyone trust it to know what the principles of our Te Tiriti o Waitangi could possibly be? About the need to clarify, Te Tiriti o Waitangi is clear and unambiguous. If there is any ambiguity, international law's contra proferentum speaks about that. It must also always work against the interests of the party who provided the wording, meaning the Māori version always ought to have applied. The government has had 185 years to understand Te Reo Minga Tikanga Māori, to understand the crystal clarity of the preamble and each article. It is on the government to be upskilled, not to lower the standards of something for lack of interest to learn. The bill is a mere shadow of the real thing, and like shadows, leaves much more dangerous room for the ambiguity it professes to clarify. 2, the principles that underpin this bill, the rule of law, democracy, and that every individual is clear under the law, are simply and have never been true. They are what are known as something my old professor Bernard Brown taught me in jurisprudence, legal fictions, a construct used in law where a thing is taken to be true, which is not in fact true, in order to achieve an outcome. Which brings me to principle 1, the civil government having full power to govern in accordance with the rule of law. Yet the government of New Zealand did not follow the rule of law or democracy to establish itself in Aotearoa after 1840. It had to suspend these very principles to grab the full power to govern and make these laws against what was promised in Te Tiriti, because Māori were the majority, 100,000 to 2,000. Meaning, being able to participate lawfully under the British legal system requirements, we would have still retained our tino rangatiratanga. But the law excluded Māori by insisting on individual land ownership foreign to Māori, excluding wahine Māori foreign to tikanga Māori, and English literacy as a means to vote. Then the government only gave Māori 4 seats to represent the whole of Māori in Aotearoa. And Blackstone in 1768 said a legal fiction should only be used to prevent injustice, yet the government has used these legal fictions to justify and create many more injustices. This puts into question the government's legitimacy to have any, let alone full power, under their very own self-claimed rule of law. And the other legal fiction, that all are equal under the law without discrimination, continued in the bill's principle 3, is again simply not true. It is English law that has and continues to discriminate. The law has discriminated whilst breaking every Te Tiriti promise through a series of laws and cases well known, Tohunga Act, Native School Act, etc. And our statistics tell on the government. Numbers don't lie, for they reveal which demographics have and do flourish in New Zealand society, male and Pākehā, and who do not, Māori, Pacifica, women, etc., etc. So why should we trust this bill when its principles are not applied in practice? Just a quick word on principle 2, when it talks about the rights everyone else has, I just want to remind that the British did not want Māori to consider anyone else's rights but their very own. They wanted special preferential treatment before the rights of anybody else. I find it interesting that they should care so much about everyone now. If a bill hangs on these 3 precepts, to unify, to clarify, Te Tiriti, and to follow the rule of law and democracy, then the bill is at best erroneous in its kaupapa. At worst, it is dangerous for everyone who is not Pākehā and male. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Kia ora, thank you, Sarah. We'll go straight to Huhanu, who has a question.
Tēnā koe te uri o tauhinare. Tēnā koe I tō whai whakaaro ki te puta mai mo tēnei pire mō ngā mātāpono o Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Thank you, Sarah, for bringing your voice to the tepu, and I wanted to ask a question. As a mokopuna of signatories to Te Tiriti o Waitangi and a mokopuna of tauhinare who came into the kāwanatanga space with good intent for the well-being of our people, do you think that tauhinare and those tupuna who signed Te Tiriti o Waitangi would see in 2025 the massive impact of landlessness, of our whānau being destitute in their own rohe, our tamariki mokopuna being impacted across various pieces of legislation and being locked up? We're at the bottom of every statistic. Do you think that for Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the work of tauhinare and that reanga of members of parliament, that they were trying their best to see the fruition of that Te Tiriti relationship, that all might thrive in Aotearoa?
Kia ora, huhana, e whananga. Yeah, well, if you remember that when Granny Toe was in government, the Te Tiriti o Waitangi was a nullity under the law because of the judge, Prendergast, for 100 years. So, and in his vision to continue to reclaim Te Tiriti as a living karanga of his tupuna, let alone the uri to come, he built that wharerunanga on Waitangi grounds. I feel so passionate and angry, I could cry. So no, he had great vision and hope.
Kia ora, Sarah. Thank you for that. Look, I know Maria Mino Kapakingi has a question, but we don't have time to go to it. So I'm sorry for that. We've got to move to our next submitter. Thank you for submission. Kia ora.
Kia ora tātou.
Our next submitter is Roger Gower, who we have for 5 minutes. Kia ora, Roger. We've got you here for 5 minutes to speak to your submission. In the interest of time, I'll just hand straight over to you.
Thank you. Chairperson, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Roger Gower, and I fully support the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi Bill. My maunga is Kakapuka, and my te awa is the Puniu from the Waikato. At its core, this bill is about clarity, equality, and democracy. Over time, the undefined principles of the treaty have been used to justify judicial activism and expanding interpretations that were never part of the original agreement, as we saw in the last presenter. This has led to the legal uncertainty, growing division, and in some cases race-based policies that undermine equal citizenship. New Zealand is a democracy. It's not a partnership between ethnic groups. As former Prime Minister David Lange rightfully said, we can have a democratic form of government, or we can have Indigenous sovereignty, but they can't coexist, and we can't have them both. The idea of a partnership continues to distort legal and political discourse, and it's creating separate rights rather than equal rights. The Waitangi Tribunal has placed an increasing role in this, and often acting more as an activist body than an impartial institution. Its recent opposition to the bill reinforces its political bias rather than legal clarity. The new version of Principle 2, as proposed by Cabinet, risks prolonging these issues by allowing judicial interpretation that can only fuel separatism and benefit the legal industry rather than ordinary New Zealanders. So we need a clear legislative definition of the treaty principles, and it's long overdue. However, to quote Martin Luther King, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. This bill is a step toward achieving that division in New Zealand. As Governor Hobson stated at the signing of the treaty in 1840, e iwi tahi tatou, we are now one people. That vision will guide us today. I urge this committee to support the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi Bill and ensure that New Zealand remains a unified, equal, and democratic nation. Thank you, and I welcome any questions.
Kia ora, thank you for that. Members, does anyone have a question? Maria Mino Kapakingi.
Just one, Roger. Tēnā rā hoki koe. Roger, so in your interpretation, you've interpreted he iwi kotai tātou, one person, one people, as the same people. Is that how you've interpreted? Therefore, we're the same type, we're the same thinking, the same everything. So we're the same people. Is that how you understand that? Because that's how I'm hearing your discussion.
Oh, and thank you for the question. No, I don't think so. And I reflect on other conversations around this. And I, for example, act as a mentor for refugees. And we've got a refugee family that we work with who came to New Zealand with nothing, not even the shirts on their backs. They've now built a livelihood. They've now built a community here and are thriving. So this notion that somehow we owe everything to the past, I think, is troublesome. So that we are one people, well, we're not the same people. We can be this rich tapestry of many peoples, but we can't have one group having special rights within.
Just to jump in there, Roger, just one other, which is to say is a sub to that. So if that's you're welcoming and you're sharing a story about a new whānau that you've met and that's great. Do you appreciate or do you recollect that your ancestors were provided the permission to live here? In fact, they were provided. In fact, they were invited and allowed to live here because of an agreements in 1835 and 1840. Do you understand that at all? Did you receive that kind of education when you were going to school here or anything like that?
Well, I lived in Te Awamutu. This notion that New Zealand history was never taught is completely incorrect. We had a lot of local history. The Battle of Araco was fought in my backyard, so I'm very familiar with that. But so the people that arrived before 1840, did they receive that permission?
Yeah, no, it's okay. I'm happy to ask the questions. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Thank you. Look,
Yes.
thank you for your submission, Roger. We're out of time, but thanks for coming along. Much appreciated. Kia ora.
Thank you.
Members, our next submitter is Su-Wuen Ong, and I apologise if I have not got that name pronounced very well, but Su-Wuen, got you there. Just get your camera and audio on.
Okay, camera, sorry.
Kia ora.
Okay.
No, that's fine. Look, welcome to the Justice Select Committee. We've set aside 5 minutes to hear from you, including any questions. So I'll hand straight over to you. Kia ora.
Okay, thank you, Duncan, and hello, MPs. I want to highlight my opposition to the bill, and I'm sort of coming from a semi-legal perspective rather than a historical one. I'm a Malaysian Chinese immigrant, so I can't say I have much to say about the historical background to it, but I want to highlight what I see internal inconsistencies about the bill. So Clause 6A talks about rule of law and democratic society. I have a problem with both of those things with respect to the bill. I don't think it's a rule of law when two parties enter into a contract and then one party later on says, well, I'm going to arbitrarily redefine the terms that are within the treaty without the consent of the other party. I think that breaks contract law. And Duncan, I think you as a lawyer, you can much better talk about that than I can. But anyway, that's my view about that. I also don't think it's democratic where the government imposes its will on its people because effectively it is. It's sort of saying, I'm going to impose my interpretation of the wording of the treaty. And it's a real sleight of hand. It's sort of saying, yes, you can keep the wording of the treaty, but we will reinterpret everything. I mean, it's like saying that I will sell you a piece of land, but later on say, but the piece of land only involves half an acre instead of the full piece of land. I believe that the treaty is really using a legal sleight of hand to try and achieve its aims, and I don't believe that that's proper in a rule of law society, which is curious because the ACT Party always talks about the rule of law and always about upholding contract law between parties, and in this case, it is doing neither. So that's the short version of my submission, and I welcome any questions.
Kia ora, thank you for that. We have got your written submission here, which I have read, and a nice little analogy there. We've got a question from Huhana Linden.
I've got a mihi, actually. Thank you very much. It's as simple as that, Matua. It's as simple as that. You got the agreement between two parties. You don't get to go and revisit it without the consent of both sides, eh?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I can't say I'm going to sell you my, my house, and then so 3 years down the track, so I'll say, well, actually, what I meant was that I'm going to sell you the little shed at the back of my house or something like that. So,
yeah, okay, a great little analogy. Thank you very much for that submission. I think we're done here, but thank you for coming along. It's really appreciated. Kia ora.
Okay, you're welcome.
Members, we have our last submitter for the day, Taumata o Ngati Whakau Iha Aki Trust. No. Kia ora, good to see you. We've got you on screen there. Look, we've got you for 10 minutes today to submit on the Principles of Treaty of Waitangi Bill. So in the interest of time, I'll hand right over to you. If you could leave some time for questions at the end, that would be fantastic.
Kia ora tātou. Tēnā koe te tima, te tia mana e te kai whakahaere ki a koutou te pōari hoki. Ko nongatai te maunga, ko rotorua nui a kahu, o te momo i te moana, ko te papai uru te marae, ko te arawa te waka, ko Taumata kapu te rangatira, ko Ngati Whakaue te iwi, ko Mokunui Arangi Kingi, e kōrero ati ki a koutou, tēnā koutou. As a current trustee and recently appointed chair of the Te Taumata o Ngati Whakaue Ihoake Trust, I have submitted this the submission on behalf of the trust to oppose the proposed treaty principles bill currently before Parliament. So I'll cut straight into, and you've got my submission, so I'll cut straight into those points that we are quite firm about. So Te Taumata o Ngati Whakaue Ihoake Trust stands alongside other submitters against the treaty principles bills, and our concerns are outlined as follows. The immediate and unqualified abandonment of the treaty principles bill because it contravenes local and international laws on Māori and Indigenous rights. The bill is fundamentally racist in the distorted reasoning of its interpretation of te tiriti. Article 2 has been misconstrued in its interpretation by the ACT Party, reducing the mana of the rangatira who signed the te tiriti, along with successive generations. Therefore, it is a breach of the constitutional rights of Māori as tangata whenua and a treaty partner. Hence, it should be abandoned. The government should refer to the concerns of Māori to the Governor-General as a representative of the other treaty partner. The recommendations from the Waitangi Tribunal in August last year should be adopted in full and referred to representatives of both the signatories at the time. Aotearoa New Zealand established a working party for constitutional change. Constitutional transformation based on the recommendations outlined in the Mātike Mai report. Any constitutional change should honour previous national and international agreements, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, he whakaputanga o te rangatira o Nutiriri. We should also collaborate with other Indigenous nations to form a collective of like-minded people in which Indigenous rights are foremost. So, in a bit of context, in 1840, Te Arawa declined to sign the Tiriti o Waitangi, opting to retain their own mana motuhake over their lands in Taonga. In 1858, we also declined the offer to become the first Māori king. Te Arawa did not see the relevance in living under two sovereigns. Instead, it retained its own mana motuhake and preferred to form its own relationship with the Crown. In 1881, Ngati Whakaue entered into a formal relationship with the Crown to establish the Rotorua Township. The Rotorua Township Fenton Agreement of 1880 was signed on a leaseholder basis. Consequently, as a result of the Crown's negligence to enforce the terms of the leases to the lessees, Ngati Whakaue were found destitute and impoverished, and through political and social pressures, Ngati Whakaue had to sell its lands to the government. So also another legislative change hit Ngati Whakaue with the Thermal Springs and Districts Act, which took ownership of all geothermal resources covering approximately 660,000 acres. So in that short time, as a loyal or a partner with the Crown, Ngati Whakaue not only lost its township, but it also lost its right, its mana over its geothermal resources. So in a nutshell, that sort of summarises the essence of what Ngati Whakaue, the Taumata o Iho Ake Trust wants to put forward to the committee. We are the educational and social arm of Ngati Whakaue, the iwi, and we run a successful little social organisation helping our people to educate and both socially and culturally.
Kia ora, thank you for that, and thank you for leaving time for questions. I see Marae Mano Kapakingi has a question.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Chair. E te papa tēnā koe e te aroa tēnā koutou katoa. Pai ki te rongo ki wau kōrero me tō tuhinga. Tēnā koe e te papa tēnā koe. So the Prime Minister will vote this down. So his party's voting this down. New Zealand First, they will vote this bill down. Right? Tōtu Tiriti, 100,000 people march to say this is an utter nonsense and an absolute waste of our time. And then Ngāpuhi, as you would have seen e te papa on the Tiriti grounds yesterday or the day before, turned their backs, as did a group of stunning wahine Māori nor te Kainganei. What do you make, all of those are, resistance. What do you make of that? What do you make of that?
First of all, I know they've always said, New Zealand First and National have always said they won't go beyond the select committee. However, the fact is that the damage is, the seed has already been laid for further discontent. We heard that when Don Brass spoke at Orewa, it was put to sleep. It's come up, it's raised its ugly head again with David Seymour. So if it does not go beyond the select committee, it still lays the seed for future discontent amongst non-Māori to an extent. So in another 5, possibly 10 years, we'll be going through the same thing again, unless Māori decide to act now, mobilise and do something about it.
Thank you for that. If there's no other questions from members, I have a question that's around the work that your trust does with your iwi and people. I guess, is that, I'm going to invite you to comment on this. Is that really a expression of tino rangatiratanga in terms of shaping your own people's futures in your own way?
Yes, it is. It is a form of a sense of tino rangatiratanga. I wouldn't go as far as saying it's our mana motu hake, because we still have to answer to the government in terms of our policies, because we're largely funded by government funded, like many other NGOs. So it is a form of tino rangatiratanga. We get to design our programs to suit our people.
Thank you. That's a really helpful comment. Kia ora for that. Look, I think that's the end of the submission. So thank you. You are our last submitter for today. So thank you for that. Tēnā koe and kia ora. Thanks very much. Members, that brings the end of the submissions. I don't think there's any matters of general business. If anyone's got anything they wish to raise, now's the time. Other than that, thank you for all your work today. It's been a good day. Kia ora and ka kite.
Ka kite, Duncan.
Yeah.